Welcome everybody. Welcome to this town hall conversation with 4 of Australia's climate commissioners, 4 of the 6. I'll introduce them and myself in just a moment, but first of all I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders from many other communities that may be here tonight. My name is Paul Barry. I'm a former ABC journalist. Hope you won't hold that against me. I'm also an author, and I'm going to be the traffic cop here tonight. My job is merely to make things run smoothly, to ensure that we have a civil conversation. The climate commissioners are here to explain their view of climate change and what we need to do about it to you, but they're also here to listen. And so after they've given their presentations, we will get some question time. We will have something like an hour, and I'll talk to you a little bit later about how I want to run that. But you will get a chance to ask questions, and they'll get a chance to listen to you and to your concerns. The climate commissioners we have here tonight are Professor Tim Flannery, who is the Chief Climate Commissioner here on my left, right as you look, Mr. Jerry Houston, who's on the far end, Professor Leslie Hughes, and Professor Will Steffen. Tim Flannery will introduce them properly in just a moment. The aim of this evening is to begin a conversation, and first of all what the commissioners are going to do is going to tell you what they've done in Wollongong today and also explain some of the basics that, about climate science and what they believe should be done about it, about the global warming. The first person we're going to hear from is Professor Tim Flannery, who is the Chief Climate Commissioner. He's just got off a plane. He's feeling pretty tired, but he's going to lift himself for you. He's one of Australia's leading writers on climate change. He's also a very popular writer on climate change. He's a fantastic writer on climate change. He's an internationally acclaimed scientist. He is also an explorer and conservationist, and he was Australian of the Year in 2007. He's held various academic positions. He's been Professor at the University of Adelaide, Director of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, and Principal Research Scientist of the Australian Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Tim Flannery.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that great introduction. And could I thank you all and welcome you all, thank you all for being here this evening and welcome you all to this event. This really is your evening, and I believe it's a great opportunity for people to engage with some of Australia's best minds on climate science and on the business response to the challenge that climate change represents to all of us. Before I introduce my fellow commissioners and hand over to them, I just want to say a few words about the Climate Commission. The Climate Commission arose out of a promise by the federal government last year. The Gillard government came to power and set up the commission in February. We're an independent commission, however, so we don't do the bidding of government. We don't take direction from government, even though we're funded from government. But we are independent, and that independence is very precious to us. We are tasked with doing 3 things, really. We want to get out among the Australian public, discuss the science of climate change, economic options for a country like Australia to pursue as we address climate change, and also look at what's happening internationally. So that's our remit. We do that in a number of ways. We produce reports, and in fact our first report, called The Critical Decade, was presented to Parliament in May this year and received bipartisan support. So both sides of politics recognised that report as being a sound underpinning for our scientific understanding of climate change, and we were very pleased at that because we think that bipartisan support is very precious, not just for the work we do, but for Australia addressing these very complex and difficult issues. We also engage in town hall meetings like this, but before we come to meet you, we like to know something about your community. So we arrived in Wollongong last night, had a very nice meal at one of your Vietnamese restaurants here in town, and then spent today going out and looking at the steelworks in town, visiting the university to see what's being done there, and also engaging with a number of your community leaders at the Green Jobs Conference at the Novotel. So we've got a bit of a sense, at least, of what some of the issues are for you and some of the initiatives that are happening in your community in relation to climate change. One thing the Commission doesn't do is comment on policy. We won't comment on government policy or on opposition policy for that matter. for the simple reason that we believe that if we give up a bit of power, so the power to do that, we gain some authority. The waters of this climate change issue are deeply muddied by many people with many different opinions. We want to stay away from that and present to you the basic peer-reviewed science, so that's the accepted science, and the broadest consensus views we can get in the economic and political areas, as I said, of what's happening overseas. I just want to say a brief word about peer-reviewed science because it's often misunderstood. When an article gets sent in, submitted to a journal and reviewed, the process is a little bit like an auditor going through a set of books or accounts at a business. They'll go through and make sure that all of the figures add up, make sure that it's internally coherent, so in the case of science, so that it conforms with our understanding of physics and chemistry and so forth. And so once you get a bit of peer-reviewed science, you can be pretty sure that it's accurate. To rely on other sorts of science or someone's opinion is a bit like making an investment in a company without checking the books to make sure that they've been properly audited. We can all do the due diligence on that and make sure that we only use credible sources of information. They're readily available to all of us through the major scientific academies of the world. Look up the Australian Academy of Sciences statement on climate change if you wish. If you don't trust them, go to the US Academy of Sciences or the Royal Society in Britain, or if you don't trust any of them, go to the Chinese Academy of Sciences website and see what's being said. But without doing that due diligence, you are almost certain to be misled because there are many opinions out there which are unsubstantiated. So that peer review process is particularly important to us. I think now I'd like to hand over to our commissioners who will be making a presentation, but I'd like you to get to know us a bit personally as well, and I'm going to, as I introduce them, ask them to say a little bit about what got them into this climate change space. And I'll begin with myself. I became interested in climate change, well, I've known about the issue for decades, but I realised in probably the late 90s that I'd really missed something. For a decade and a half before that, I'd been working in the mountains of Melanesia, climbing remote mountain summits in the Solomon Islands, on Papua New Guinea, West Papua and so forth. And one thing I noticed wherever I went was that the tree line was advancing. And initially I thought maybe the tree line was advancing on the mountains because people were using the mountain summits differently, that perhaps they were burning in a different way or had stopped burning and so the trees were able to advance. But it was so consistent that eventually I realised that there was something more behind this. It was only when I read the scientific literature with a bit more diligence than I had in the past that I realised this was a very clear signature of the warming trend that we see globally, and that somehow, even though I was a trained scientist, I'd missed the full significance of it. So once I had that realisation and had read the science, I was committed to learning more about climate change and becoming more engaged with the issue. Because I thought if I've missed a trick here, if I've missed understanding it, then I don't know what hope my mum and dad or other people who aren't scientists have of getting up to date with what's happening. So that's how I got here, that's why I'm here before you this evening. Will Steffen, Professor Will Steffen is he'll be giving the first presentation, so I'll introduce him next. I don't know whether you want to speak from there, Will, or come up here, but you're most welcome to do whichever.
So, do you want me to then go into the presentation straight away?
No.
I'll speak from here.
Sure. I was just going to say to Will that Will is one of Australia's most respected, or the world's most respected climate scientists, and he's got an interesting personal story to tell.
Yeah, well, look, I got interested probably a long, long time ago is where it started from. My native country. I was born and raised in the US, as you can probably tell quickly from my accent, but in a very small town in a rural state called Iowa, we only had one field trip, I remember, because we talked to some people out at the Blue Scope Steelworks today, and they had students coming in all the time. Well, I only had one, and that was to an abattoir in Sioux City, Iowa. And I decided there's got to be better things to do in one's life than to study abattoirs. So I guess that got me off on a different direction. But really, my roots in America come from a state called Missouri, and if anyone knows American states, they all have nicknames. And the nickname for the state of Missouri is the Show Me State. It's the ultimate skeptical state. You've really got to show somebody from Missouri what's going on. So that got me interested in science. I did engineering at the University of Missouri and then came down to Australia. And it was really in the 1980s when I was doing a fairly ordinary career in chemistry, inorganic chemistry, so things like carbon cycle and so on, that I saw an international program that started studying the Earth as a system. A very visionary program for that time, and that got me very enthused. Going back to my engineering background, which is very systems-oriented, you create systems like the system that generates steel out at Port Kembla. But it really got me thinking of our Earth as a system, the role of us humans in that, and of course the climate is a very important part of that system. So it's sort of a winding tour starting from that abattoir in Sioux City, Iowa, but eventually ending up studying the planet and really getting enthused about how science can really tackle some of the most important issues we face.
Thanks very much, Will. I'm glad you're not a slaughterman. You didn't go into the abattoir business. Could I introduce Professor Leslie Hughes, our next Climate Commissioner, who along with me is at Macquarie University. Leslie is a world expert on adaptation and climate change, and particularly impacts of climate change on biodiversity.
Thanks, Tim. I got into climate change research basically by default. I'd done my PhD on ant behaviour. I'm a behavioural ecologist and zoologist, and after following ants around the bush for about 4 years, I was pretty heartily sick of that and was looking for something else to do, and somebody said, you know, I think climate change might be an interesting issue, and that was 20 years ago, and indeed it was an interesting issue then, and it has become an even more interesting issue since. And I've stayed in climate change because I've become increasingly concerned about the risks to our ecosystems from climate change. But really the fundamental reason why I do things like this is not because I'm a scientist, it's because I'm a parent, and I do this because I'm concerned about my children's future.
Thanks so much, Leslie. Our final member of the Commission is Mr. Jerry Houston, who has recently retired as President of BP Australasia. And Jerry, you seem to be the odd one out. Why are you here?
Well, a very good question, Tim. I suppose in my mind it goes back to 1996. I've worked for the last 34 odd years with BP, an energy company, and in 1996 our chief executive then, John Brown, came out and stepped away from his peers and said, I believe that there's sufficient evidence out there that on climate change science for us to recognise this as a major risk, and we should be doing something about it. Good business sense, but until then, I think the energy industry had been pretty much in denial on this, and that had a ripple effect through the company. We had to, for something that we regarded as being a long-term issue, nothing to worry about in the short term, it became part of the fabric of BP, because we then said, well, we better find out what this is all about. And from then it went from being a certainly a major business risk, because it impacts on the very sustainability of BP, to thinking, well, this is a risk for our kids and our grandkids. And I've been involved in the process ever since then. I've been involved in every manifestation of government initiatives on this, in terms of representing my company and parts of business. And one of the things I've been saying quite loudly for a long time is that there's still people out there who are very who aren't hearing the story that the scientists have put together, and so I've said to a lot of the scientists, for God's sake, you're going to have to speak up a lot louder. So with that sort of advice to them over many years, then I couldn't really knock back the opportunity to spend some time with them, and I'm enjoying every moment of it, I have to say.
Thanks so much, Jerry, and we do try to have a bit of fun as we go about doing this as well. Could I just acknowledge the presence of two members of Parliament, who I didn't see earlier. Stephen Jones and Sharon Bird, I think, are with us, so thank you so much, wherever you are, both of you, for being here. Thanks, Stephen. There they are in the middle of the room there. Tremendous for you to come along with your busy schedules. Thank you so much. Now look, I'm just going to hand over now for a very brief presentation on climate science by Professor Will Steffen, followed by a word from Leslie and a wrap-up by myself, and then it'll be over to you. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tim. We get asked a lot of questions about the science, so I thought we'd just give a very brief overview of the fundamentals so that we can get on the same page before we start with all the interesting questions. So the first graph is the classical one. This is the global average temperature of the air at the surface of the Earth, and it goes back to about 1880 all the way up to 2010. And these measurements are done by professionals in the field. The Australian measurements, which contribute to that, are done by our Bureau of Meteorology, based in Melbourne, and their counterparts around the world add to that. Now notice about 1950, 1960 or so, a little bit after that, temperatures started rising quite steadily. And that's in synergy with the rise of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. I'll talk about that in a moment. If you look at the last decade, you see that the three warmest years have been 1998, 2005, and 2010. The year we just finished was equal first, or in some records, the warmest. But the interesting thing is, although a lot of people really focus on this record, as a scientist, we actually look elsewhere. We look into the ocean. And the reason we do that is the ocean covers about 70% of the Earth's surface. And it has a much higher heat capacity than the air. It can hold a lot more heat. So nearly 90% of the extra heat that are generated by these extra greenhouse gases actually goes in the ocean. And you see a similar record there. Again, from about 1970 or so onwards, there's a steady increase in the heat content of the ocean. Now, there's a variability from year to year. That's natural. Variability will still occur. But it's the underlying trend we're concerned about, because that's the signal of the longer-term climate change. But there's even further evidence that the Earth is warming. This is some data from the sea ice that sits over the North Pole, over the Arctic Ocean. And that black line that runs all the way down to 2100, of course we haven't got to 2100 yet, so that can't be data. That's actually a model projection. That's a climate model that is suggesting what should happen to that sea ice. The jagged red data are the actual observations. So you see they vary quite a bit from year to year. But the trend is quite clear. That area of the Earth is losing ice at a very rapid rate. And it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to see that sometime, probably before the middle of the century, that will be ice-free in the Northern Hemisphere summertime. But it also tells you that perhaps the climate models, if anything, are too conservative. They're not picking up how fast this part of the Earth is changing. So these are three pieces of evidence. There's even more that's all internally consistent that tells us that the Earth is warming. So scientists actually use a plain English word to describe that. We use the word unequivocal. And that means in our minds, and based on the evidence, based on our ability to interpret the evidence, there's no doubt that the planet is warming. There is no debate in as Tim said, the peer-reviewed literature, the literature that's gone through that quality control. So what's causing that? Well, a lot of people say, well, the Earth naturally warms and cools. Why isn't it just natural variability? Well, the Earth does warm and cool naturally, but we know a lot about that. We know what triggers it. We know the time frames it works on. And natural variability should not be warming the Earth in the 20th and 21st centuries. We're in a period called the Holocene, geological period of Earth history, in which the temperature should be more or less stable for another 10 or 20,000 years. So this doesn't look at all like natural variability. But furthermore, we know the physics of these extra gases that we've added to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. This little cartoon shows you what they do. The energy from the sun, which warms the Earth's surface, is then transmitted back out to space as heat. Otherwise, the Earth would continually warm and burn up. It doesn't do that. But these gases that are in the lower atmosphere, just to give you an idea of where they reside, when you take an airplane flight to America or to Europe, and you're taking one of these long-haul flights, and the pilot comes on, and if he uses the old scale, he says we're cruising at 39,000 feet. Or if he uses the new one, he says 11 or 12,000 meters. You're well above the belt of greenhouse gases. They're below you, between you and the Earth's surface. So they're trapping the heat that's coming out from the Earth's surface, some of it, and re-radiating it, some of it, back down to the surface. That gives you the extra warmth. And it's a good thing it does that, or else the Earth would be frozen all the time, because greenhouse gases are naturally in the atmosphere. So from fundamental physics that we've known for a century and a half, we know that if you add extra greenhouse gases, the Earth is going to warm. And that's exactly what it's doing. So the physics is right, the observations are right, and there's a lot of other evidence we call fingerprints that I won't go into, that also tell us that this is not natural variability, it's greenhouse gases. I'll just give you one bit of that evidence. So what we're going to do here is, if you look at that time scale, 1900 to 2000, that's the past. So what we can do is we can take a climate model and say, let's run it in the past, and give it the things that affect natural variability, changes in sunlight, changes in volcanoes. So we do that, and we get a wavy line. There should be some variability in climate due to natural variability, and that's what it should look like due to those two main factors that drive variability. But then we say we know that greenhouse gases have gone up. So let's put those in the climate model and with the natural variability say what should happen. So the temperature should look like that when we add in the greenhouse gases. Now, we can actually test this because this has already occurred. We actually have a temperature record. So we can say which one is right. Is it natural variability or is it greenhouse gases that are causing most of that warming? So here comes our scientist, our Bureau of Meteorology scientist who comes in and says, well, I can measure the temperature. And so he or she measures the temperature, and that's what they get, that black line. So this is an example of how we actually test our knowledge of the climate system. And it's quite clear that the only way you can explain observations is if you put those extra greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So the point I want to say about science, climate science, is it's absolutely clear on 2 points. One is the Earth is warming, and there are other associated climate changes we'll talk about. And second point is we know why it's warming. It's warming primarily due to these additional greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Well, now, what are the consequences? Leslie's going to talk mainly about that, but I just want to introduce one principle. And that's a small change in average temperature, like a degree or 2 degrees or even 3 degrees, doesn't sound like very much. You say, well, if it's 28 degrees on a January day in Wollongong, what does it matter if it's 29? Doesn't feel that different. The real issue are in these extremes, hot or cold. And we've put this little urban train there because people actually plan their lives, their infrastructure, their buildings based on that range of temperature. That's what we're used to. That's what we plan for. But when you increase that average, and we've already raised it by 1 degree in Australia, and there's more to come, what you find is that the cold extremes really get much less, much fewer. But the warm extremes, you see a lot more of them, and you see more record warm temperatures, temperatures you haven't experienced. So what this means is you design infrastructure for the old climate, and it can't cope with the new climate. We already see this in Melbourne. That's their public transport system, where the rails buckled when the temperatures hit 46 degrees in 2009 in February. It wasn't designed for that temperature. But we know we're going to get more of those days, and even hotter temperatures as temperature continues to rise. So the real question now is, we know the science very well. We need to focus on what are the risks and what do we do about minimizing the risks. So now to bring it down to what really matters for you guys here, we'll talk about this part of Australia, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Leslie Hughes.
So Will's given a brief introduction to the global and the national scene. Let me talk briefly about what we might expect might happen here at Wollongong and the Illawarra region. We know that temperatures have been going up in New South Wales. We've had about a degree of warming since the 1950s, generally in New South Wales. And we also know that we've been in a drying trend in New South Wales and in most of the eastern part of Australia for about the last 40 years. And that map there, the browny bits, are the bits where the climate has been getting drier. The greeny bits are the bits where the climate has been getting wetter, and you can see that it has been getting wetter up in the northwest, but all down the east coast and the southwest it's been getting drier. What do we expect in the future? Well, one of the things we get when temperatures go up is that we get more intense and more frequent bushfires, and we can measure the danger of bushfires using an index that's called the Forest Fire Danger Index, and this has gone up in southern New South Wales between 10 and 40%, depending on the region, since about the 1980s. In Nowra, for example, it's gone up about 30%. What we're projecting for the future, and it's a very complicated projection because lots of things affect the chance of fire, is a further increase of about 20 to 30% in the region. Sea levels are rising. They've risen on average across the globe about 20 centimetres. We would expect those to keep going, though it's regionally very, very variable. There are some parts of Australia where sea level is going up much faster than in other parts. But in general, the IPCC estimates that we would expect a rise over the next century of between 50 centimetres and about a metre. And to put that in perspective, a 50 centimetre sea level rise means that a coastal flooding event that now takes place once every 100 years might take place once every few months. We're also getting changing rainfall patterns. The models are pretty uncertain about regional changes in rainfall in the future. Some of the models for this region indicate drying, ongoing drying, others indicate more rain. We do think that rainfall will become in more intense bursts, which of course increases the chance of flooding, but the overall rainfall projections are still extremely uncertain. What I study is the impact of all of this on ecosystems and biodiversity. Biodiversity is our life support system. We rely on species to feed us, for our fibre, to decompose our waste, to filter our water and to provide our oxygen. It's not just about fluffy cuddlies, it's our life support system and the planet's life support system. These are just two of the endangered species from this region, the green and golden bellfrog and the southern brown bandicoot. There are about 100 species just in the Illawarra that are listed under state legislation as being endangered. These are the sort of species that we'll be worried about soonest because they have small ranges, small populations, and are under stress also from other factors. And we're expecting greatly accelerated species extinction rates in the future and really transformations of the sorts of ecological communities that we know today. Now, scientists really love graphs. This is a graph that really takes its name from the title, or we've based our report, The Critical Decade, on this sort of concept. What it shows us is that there's two potential futures for this planet. The future, what we can see here is the wiggly black line is the temperature that we've had so far. It's just a different representation of that first graph that Will showed. And then we've got two potential futures. The blue band is the band of mean annual temperatures that we might expect the world to experience if we manage to cut greenhouse gas emissions very, very dramatically and keep global temperatures to below 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level. The red band is the future that if we continue to go the business as usual scenario, that's the sort of temperature range that we might expect to see by the end of this century. Now, as I said, scientists love graphs, but often it's a bit hard to relate in a personal way to a graph, so I'm going to finish by making this graph extremely personal for me anyway. I was born in the 1960s, so I've drawn that bar there over my, hopefully, if I live till I'm 85, that bar represents my lifespan, and I've drawn it at a level on the graph at the average temperature that I might expect to experience over my life. Now, I've got two teenage kids born in the 1990s, and I've drawn that bar for their lifespan at the mean annual temperature that they might expect to experience under a business as usual scenario. I don't have grandchildren yet, but if I do get them, and my kids have them at the age of about 30 and they live till they're about 85, that bar represents the mean annual temperature that my grandchildren and your grandchildren will experience if we keep emitting greenhouse gases at the rate that we're doing. What our challenge is for all of us is to try to bring that bar down to that 2 degree, what we call the guardrail. So the main message of the Climate Commission is that this is the critical decade to act. The risks are real and the need for action is extremely urgent. And with that, I'll hand back to Tim.
Thanks very much, Will and Leslie. I'm going to be extremely brief here because I'm aware that time's creeping away and we want to hear from you. But I think it's important, after having seen the science and the potential adverse outcomes there, to recognise that there are also opportunities that can be had from addressing climate change early. We can see that globally the nations of the world are starting to address this issue. The beginnings of a new global green economy are taking shape, and those countries and nations that invest the most in terms of developing intellectual property and developing industries that take advantage of that shift are ultimately going to be advantaged. Now, in this area, it's very difficult for us, I think, to say where those opportunities may lie, but I'm sure people here in the audience have some good ideas. We certainly heard at the Green Jobs conference this afternoon lots of interesting leads in terms of where this community can benefit from addressing climate change early on. Having said that, I'm going to hand back to our MC and look forward to hearing from you, the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It's a pretty scary graph that Leslie showed us. I haven't yet got grandchildren. Be thinking twice about having them, I think, if I believed that, and I think I do. Right, it's now your turn to ask the commissioners. We've got about an hour. There's a number of pre-registered questions that have been put on the website. I'm going to be drawing from a mixture of those and questions from the floor. I would ask you that questions be brief and they be focused and that you only ask one question. I'm not going to accept statements. If we get statements from people and if people go on, I'm just going to move on to the next questioner. It's a civil conversation, that we're all respectful of each other's points of view, that it doesn't turn into a political statement or too much of a Barney. So, can I have some questions, please? What about someone from the younger generation, given that the younger generation is the one that is going to be most affected? People like me are going to die, hopefully, before most of this comes to pass. What about the people who really have a stake in this debate, which is the young people? What about a question from someone, a younger person?
My name is James, and I'm actually from the country south of Canberra, on the Murrumbidgee River, a little place called Tharwa. But I have been residing in the Illawarra region for the last 3 years, and love it. I'm in all agreement to all of this, there's no doubt about it. But interestingly, you were talking into, sorry, what was your name again? I can't...
Leslie Hughes, Professor Hughes.
Just interestingly, maybe just to create a bit of a conversation, that model that you showed towards the end, is it possible for a human being, so the grandchildren of the grandchildren of the grandchildren, presuming that the Earth will survive what would be mass increases of temperatures, can human beings adapt to such temperature rises like that in a sustainable and healthy life?
Yeah, that's a big question. Depends, I suppose. Depends on where they live. Depends on what they do, what they eat. All organisms of any sort have an upper physiological limit above which they can't survive. Ours is probably, with technology of, air conditioning and that sort of thing, we can probably survive, and people indeed do live in very, very hot and dry parts of the world. I think the question is, can we sustain a global population under those conditions? Almost certainly not. Can we feed a global population under those conditions? Almost certainly not. And most of the biodiversity on which we would depend have less adaptive capacity than we do. So at some point, no, we won't survive. But we don't know where that point is.
Another question?
Yes, hello. My name is Les Brook. I live here in the area. And what I would like to ask is, this is obviously one world, one problem. To me, it raises the question, to fix this one problem, one global problem, it sort of forces humanity to see itself as one humanity. How can that happen?
Not making great progress at the moment, are we? Perhaps, Tim, you could answer that. I mean, maybe I could phrase it also in the context of what the shock jocks might say, which is, why should we take action if nobody else is going to?
That's right. Look, the question you asked is the one that I have been thinking about for the last 5 or 6 years, I guess, since I became involved in the Copenhagen Climate Council, which was helping, advance towards the COP15, the big climate meeting we had. And what we saw very clearly there were that the current mechanisms that we have for people to cooperate globally are not very good. Because the UN, for example, it's based on nations. And when you go into the UN chamber, you see that every nation from China to the US to Monaco with 7,000 people or whatever it is, and San Marino with 3,000, they all have the same size desk, right? They all sort of, and there's something sort of wrong with that, you know, that, and especially the way the numbers work out with voting. It doesn't represent the population as a whole. And, you know, we saw that at the meeting, it's incredibly difficult to get agreement where you've got 130 or 140 heads of government together there. Extremely difficult to get agreement on things.
So what do we do? Can I ask that?
Well, yeah, sure. And look, I take a really long-term view of this. You know, and if you look back 60 years, we had newly come out of a world at war, you know. The Europeans were at each other's throat. We were fighting a war in the Pacific. It was a horrendous situation. Since that time, that experience was so scarring and so damaging, we've started to build political entities that help us overcome those problems of conflict. So the European Union's a really good example of that, where through sharing economic prosperity, people have worked out that they can have a different future. After Europeans being at war with each other for at least 1,000 years, probably longer. So we are capable of reinventing our politics as we move on. What we've seen come out of the Copenhagen meeting is an agreement whereby each individual nation says, well, look, while I can't pledge to be part of a treaty with an international police force looking into this and whatever, what I can pledge is to reduce my emissions in a particular way. And every nation has done that. Australia has done it. We've pledged a unilateral reduction of 5% of our emissions below 2000 levels. Both sides of politics support that, which is very important to understand. And we'll do that no matter what the rest of the world does, and other countries have made similar pledges. So we're all working towards that common goal of making sure we don't see that temperature spike with the red line. We haven't done enough yet to assure that we'll stay below the 2-degree guardrail and give ourselves that cooler future, but progress is being made. And you've just got to think that this, you know, 6 years ago, we didn't have Al Gore and An Inconvenient Truth. General public awareness of this issue wasn't where it is today. So we do make progress. We are an innovative species. I'm cautiously optimistic that we can take that global view. And it's, when I look at my children, it's really, it comes home to me very strongly. I was 26 before I travelled outside of Australia. It was just a different world back then. It was much more expensive to travel internationally. I didn't learn a foreign language. My son and daughter both travelled in their early teenage years overseas. One of them speaks Mandarin, the other one speaks French. And they have friends on the internet globally. So the world is changing. I guess for me the big question is, will we change in time? Will we see the development of that globalised civilisation in time? And that's what hangs in the balance, I think.
Another question?
My name is John Singer. I live in Wollongong. I'm a little older than most of you, and that's one thing that bothers me. That most of the people who are involved in the science are, in my opinion, very young. And they weren't around in the 1940s and the 50s, when the very things you're predicting were the norm. I'm also a little worried.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I do, and I'm coming to that if I may. The Climate Commission is the prime scientific authority to the government, isn't it, advisor? And, well, that's how I understood it. Maybe other people understand it differently. But the Climate Commission, from what I see today...
Can I ask you to move on, please?
Yes,
I'd like you to ask a question so that everyone gets a chance to put a question to the panel.
And I'll get to the question. Most of you have a background of a time when carbon dioxide was much higher in the atmosphere than it is now. Dinosaurs, petrochemicals. Why are there no modern climatologists, physicists on the Climate Commission who would be taking a different view of the climate and perhaps representing a less dramatic paper than this, which is quite scary?
Who would like to answer that one? Will?
I'll just begin very briefly by explaining what the Climate Commission does. Because I think it's important.
Yeah, it's fine, Tim.
We don't advise government in any way, shape or form. Our job is simply to do what I said earlier, which is to go out and engage the Australian public in a dialogue on the firm science. We don't deal with the stuff that's not peer-reviewed, that's not solid, and checked and checked and checked again. We won't deal with that. But the view we put to you is the solid scientific view. We don't advise government at all. Other bodies do that. So that's our role. And just to explain, I think to hand over to Will over those other questions about dinosaurs and so forth.
There's a limited number of commissioners. We've got hundreds of very good climate scientists around Australia, including paleoscientists, who do understand the climate of the recent and the deep past. So I and Leslie attempt to represent all that by working with our colleagues, getting on top of the literature and so on. So I think we try to faithfully represent what our community here in Australia and globally are saying. You ask a very good question, and that relates to climate has been very different in the past. It's been much warmer when the dinosaurs were around. The Earth has been nearly frozen twice. We sort of call that snowball Earth. We understand those now to a large extent. The point is, humans have only been on Earth about 250,000 years, fully modern humans. Hominids, only, what, 2 or 3 million years perhaps? This is what's called the late Quaternary. So this is our home, this is our natural climate. We understand that too. We're starting to move that climate strongly and quickly outside the Holocene, the last 12,000 years, which is the only time that humans have developed agriculture, cities, villages, civilizations. So we are taking a very human-oriented context. The Earth will be fine. It's been warmer and it's been colder. I don't worry about the Earth. What I worry about are my kids and grandkids, because they live in a much narrower temperature range than the Earth has experienced in the past.
We've now got proposals for a carbon price. Would anyone like to ask a question about the carbon price?
Hi, my name's James Daly. I'm an environmental science student at the University of Wollongong. As a budding scientist, I'm quite concerned about the shift into options based more on economic principles rather than the science. Achievable targets seem to be based on what we can afford rather than what the planet can afford. So I'm wondering how we shift the debate back to the science, which is what this is primarily concerned with.
Jerry, would you like to answer that? I think that's probably one of...
Yeah, at the end of the day, you can't have what you can't pay for, I suppose. And I don't think that the world has yet moved to the point where it's sees itself as staring over the cliff, which would then say, I'm going to do everything I can at any cost. So the broad economic view today, and it's shared politically around the world, is that providing we start or ramp up our efforts from where we are at the moment, we can actually get we can actually have our cake and eat it too. So we can actually find a relatively low-cost pathway to actually achieve a much lower carbon economy and sit within the guardrails that that Will and Leslie have mentioned. So I certainly don't think we've reached the place that says I'm standing at the edge of the cliff and the option is to either fall over it or pay anything.
We are occasionally told, Jerry, that it is getting too late, that we need to act quickly.
Well, I think that's why we talk about the critical decade. I think the important thing for us is to provide ourselves with the assurance by the end of this decade that not only are our emissions trending down, but also globally we're in a position where we can convince ourselves that we can sit within those guardrails, and if we can't, then we need to start ramping up our efforts as the evidence comes in. But one of the things that's very clear is the longer we wait as a globe, then the more dramatic our response would need to be to get the same impact, and that's the thing that says we should be starting as soon as possible.
You had a question at the front here, I believe.
Actually, could I just, while we're
Yep, sure.
In your report, you talked a little bit about how much time we've got and what the period we need to act within. It might be worthwhile just amplifying that answer. I think.
Yeah, look, that's a good point. Very briefly, the boxes you want to tick when you look at a policy are the following. Does it actually have a long-term goal, an end game, of decarbonising or coming very close to it around mid-century? If you don't have that, it's not a credible policy. Second thing is, as Jerry said, you have to turn the trend lines down for the industrialized world, the wealthy world, this decade. The sooner the better. And the third thing is, and Jerry also made a very good point there, is that it has to have the capability, the policy has to have a capability of having ongoing input from science as we go through. You're quite right that science has an important role to play. But science evolves. We're researching all the time, new information is coming to the fore, and we need to have a mechanism that gets that into the policy process in an ongoing way. So when you look at policies, act very quickly and decisively to change the trend, have a long-term goal that's decarbonisation or close to it by mid-century, and have a way the science keeps informing policy. That's what you need, I think, to solve that challenge that you're quite properly putting to us.
Could I ask a follow-up? I mean, with the policies that both sides are currently offering, are we on track to do that?
Well, my view on that is that if you look at where we are now, let's take the 5% reduction that Tim referred to, that both parties agree to. Right now, that's relative to 2000. Right now in 2011, our emissions are considerably higher than 2000. 2020 isn't that far off. 2020 is what, 8.5 years away now?
8 years and 6 months.
8 years and 6 months away. So we've got to make a very quick exit from business as usual, which is still going up, and then get 5% down. That actually amounts, when you do the calculation, to about a 25 to 28%, I think, per capita emission reduction for every Australian in 8.5 years. Big ask. Is it enough? Well, no, not in the long term. But the important point is, I think that will be such a change from where we're going today that we will set in place both the momentum and the investment decisions that'll drive us further down the curve. That's another thing to look for is, are we setting ourselves up for those long-term cuts? Are we putting in place policies that not only drive quick emissions, but drive investment decisions that are going to shove us down in coming decades? So again, like Tim, I'm guardedly optimistic, but I think we've just got to hit that 5% reduction at a minimum this decade.
Adam.
Thanks. You've stolen my question, so I get to have a second.
Sorry.
If we do reach 2 degrees maximum temperature rise, my question's to Leslie. What do you foresee as the impact of that on biodiversity generally?
Once again, it depends. For some species, 2 degrees is too much. Probably for the Great Barrier Reef, it's very likely that 2 degrees with the associated increase in CO2 acidifying ocean waters is probably still too much. Some species will do just fine, some species will do even better with 2 degrees, but some will go extinct. Iconic ecosystems like the Great Barrier Reef would be in serious trouble even at 2 degrees.
Someone have a question about Wollongong, the effect on Wollongong?
Hi, my name's Rob Long. I'm a teacher here in Wollongong and I live in Ferry Meadow. And I'm not sure it is a science problem. I think science has got the symptom of what's going on. I think it's an economic problem, what we've got. And it's affluent countries living in a way that is affecting the world. So my question is, what have we got to do in relation to retraining our industries? What are we going to do to change the economy? And the carbon price is interesting, what we're talking about, that will drive investment, but is that going to happen quick enough, or do we have to bring in regulations that say business has to change, well, whatever your date's saying on that?
Jerry, do you want to talk about how the carbon price works in particular to achieve this stuff?
I think a price on carbon, there's many ways in which you can put a price on carbon through incentives, taxes, emissions trading schemes, but a price on carbon, if you're going to have a market-based solution which will drive us to the lowest cost, is a price is fundamental to it, because a price will drive investment, it will change behaviours. It will actually give people a choice as...
Can you tell us how? Can you explain how in words of 1 syllable? 2 syllables? 3?
I just draw the analogy as far as the carbon price is concerned. Just look at the price of bananas, how consumption of bananas has collapsed given the price. So you're seeing a price impact there. So price is important, but there are many parts where price in itself is not going to be sufficient to drive rapid take-up of new technology. That will need support, and there's going to be times when, in fact, the price signal's not enough. For example, 7 cents a litre or thereabouts on the price of petrol is not going to change behaviours more than, say, regulating what cars look like in the future. So I think it's going to be a bit of both to actually get us there in the future.
Yes.
Frank Coluccio, Wollongong Futures. The question is directly about some of the policy. I know you don't want to talk on policy, but it's the Climate Change Authority that Bernie Fraser is supposed to be running as an independent advisor to targets and whatever. When is that going to happen? Because this city went through a visioning exercise in 2001, 2002 called Wollongong Futures. It was to be a sustainable city. And the good news is, 10 years ago, I know this is a critical decade, but 10 years ago, I put forward a plan to establish Wollongong as Australia's first eco-city by reversing our carbon footprint when it started 155 years ago. And the irony is that was Peter Garrett's great-great-grandfather that started it when he did start our local paper 155 years ago to get Wollongong Harbour built. So I sort of looked at it and said, well, let's reverse that decision by having an integrated foreshore and transport plan and actually coming forward with a vision for the city.
And your question, sir?
The question is, when is the authority going to be set up? And when can I go to them? Because there was corrupt government, local government here, which we had to sack. There was a corrupt state government, basically. And I'm hoping we don't have to sack the federal government as well to try and get our first eco-city built.
Tim?
Look, I'm not aware of the timelines. I don't think they've even been announced yet as to when this authority is actually going to get into place and all the rest of it. But could I just say that the sort of planning that you've done for the city here and that I saw today at the Green Jobs Conference is exactly what's needed to put a region like this at the front of the queue in terms of getting access to what's required to transform the economy of these regions. Because without that careful forethought and planning, if you do that at the last minute, you're likely to miss out, when the announcement's made. And I must say, I've been really struck. We've done nearly 10 of these consultations now around the country. What I see here in this community is well advanced on what we've seen elsewhere, where people are actually getting together to discuss this. And that is a tremendous advantage that you shouldn't sell short. And I can understand your frustration. It didn't happen 10 years ago, but all I can say is that work isn't wasted because the time has come now, it appears, for these sort of things to happen. And I think this community is in a very good position to benefit.
Hello. Can you hear me? As well, there's a Cooperative Research Centre for Ecological Sustainability and Clean Production, which was written 10 years ago. The proposal was to hopefully here at our university, where they've taken up the land at Brandon Park, was to turn that into Environment, Technology and Business Park. Now, I congratulate the university for now putting in the first solar panel on a 6-star rating building on that. But yeah, all the plans are here, and it's quite exciting, and to know that it was Peter Garrett's great-great-grandfather. I'm not blaming him 155 years ago now, knowing that we were going to cook the planet. But to be now able to get him and come and endorse the Eco-City plan and reverse that carbon footprint and move forward, I'm quite excited, and I just want that authority to get going as quickly as possible so I can submit that.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we move on? Can I just ask, sort of following up on that general theme, how do you make the changes that are necessary to stop the world cooking and protect a place like Wollongong, which relies very much on coal and iron and steel and heavy industry and the sorts of jobs that are really, you're trying to either get rid of or change the way in which those industries are done? How do you do that? Look,
I might just, I'll hand over to Jerry briefly, but I just want to begin by saying we went out to have a look at the steelworks today, and that is a massive piece of infrastructure. I think it covers something like 80 acres. It's huge with a whole lot of plant there. There are billions of dollars worth of investment there. And when you look at changing that sort of thing to be more sustainable, to be less carbon intense, you realise that this is one of these things that it takes time. It would be wonderful to be able to just ship it all away and start off afresh with a greenfield site with really new, modern, clean technologies. The trouble is that's not the situation that we're in. When we went out to the site, we saw a number of initiatives there that over time will deliver a reduction in carbon emissions. People are looking at, for example, using biochar from forestry offcuts to replace some of their coal use. And that sort of stuff is valuable. Sure, we'd all like to see it move faster, but the reality is that it actually takes time to move big pieces of infrastructure like that on. Otherwise, you end up incurring costs, significant costs that send people broke. And I don't know, Jerry, you ran a refinery for a long time. You know about the challenges of doing that.
Yeah, the bottom line, for example, in BlueScope's cases, you've got kit which has been put in place to last for 50 years, and so we're talking about actually transforming a lot of kit that's been designed that way over the next 50 years, so restocking our capital stock, so to speak. But in terms of the solution, there is no one solution. There is no silver bullet for this, and that makes the problem very broad. But there's a lot of things that can contribute to it. Some of them are short-term ones. Some of them are a much longer time frame. So, energy efficiency is a quick win, particularly in buildings. There's a lot of things that can happen with renewables in the short term, but some of the big kick from renewables is going to be in the future when new technology gets dragged through. Biofuels is another one that, it's in the short term we have biofuels which are, okay, but in the longer term they're researching, biofuels which will actually have a zero carbon footprint in the fullness of time. So, I could carry on, but there's a lot of things out there, and it's going to require a wide portfolio of activities, sufficiently incentivised and supported across the globe to make things happen. But one thing's for sure is that we are going to have a totally different stock of assets in 50 years' time than we have today if we're going to achieve it.
I know you're not supposed to talk on policy, but do you see the carbon, a price on carbon being the most effective way to do that?
I think there's pretty wide economic consensus that if you're going to have a market-based system, you need a price. And a price will actually drive investment and it will drive a change in behaviour. But it's once again, it's not a silver bullet. You need a price as a central theme, but then you'll need other supporting mechanisms to help it along on a case-by-case basis.
There's a gentleman down on the side there. You still want to ask a question or not? No? Yeah? Yep.
Yeah, I'm Rowan Huxtable. I'm from Wollongong. My question is about the coal seam gas mines that are springing up all over the place at the moment. My question is, has there been any study done that we could look at about the comparative environmental and greenhouse effects of coal power versus coal seam gas power? And if so, where can we see it?
We do have some figures on that, and we shared them this morning with the Commission. I don't have them right in front of me, but I can make sure that you get them if you come up to us afterwards. But essentially, the story was that the most efficient, if you take the average of, say, using gas from coal seam methane, you do a cradle-to-grave analysis of how much CO2 is produced versus that for coal-fired power plants. There is a benefit. It's not as big as I was expecting it to be. I can't remember the exact order. It was like 20, 30 or 40%. It's in that range anyway of reductions in emissions from that source. But of course that's only one issue in many issues that concern the public about a shift to coal seam methane.
Yep, no, it's one behind you in a moment for you. Yep, sure, go ahead.
My name's Jack Mandam. I'm a mechatronics engineer at University of Wollongong. I just wondered what's currently holding back the development and manufacture of valuable emerging renewable and clean energy technologies, and what can we do to fix this, like these silver bullets that you were talking about? Like, for example, in the motor industry, compressed air engines and hydrogen fuels and different things that would greatly increase the cooling down of our climate at the moment.
Jerry?
Yeah, the very simple answer is there's nothing holding them back short of the right incentives. But the reason that some of these technologies have not emerged as quickly as was originally foreseen is because they're probably in the short term not the most cost-effective options. And hydrogen is something that we had a long hard look at in BP and came to the conclusion that yes, it could well be part of the mix some 30 years down the track, but in the short term there are other things like second generation biofuels, far better efficiency in terms of cars, etc., that actually and cleaner fuels that are actually going to make a bigger difference in the short term before you have to go for these longer time frame technologies. So over a long period of time you'll get a lot of technologies to play, but there's going to be a difference as to the way they play in over the next 50 odd years.
Thank you.
Yes, on the side here. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Lee Blackmore. I live in the local area. I'm just wondering, in terms of the Copenhagen conference, whether there is going to be another one. I had a world leaders meeting, or whether that has been abandoned because it was unsuccessful. And I guess the second part to the question is, Does this commission and its report have an influence, or what do you feel about the possible global influence of this commission itself?
Okay. In terms of the Copenhagen meeting, there's a meeting every year of what's called the Council of Parties to the UNFCCC, all technical stuff you don't need to know about. But effectively, there is a meeting every year, and progress is made at each of those meetings. What set the Copenhagen meeting apart was that it was one where heads of government decided to come, and it was felt to be very special for that reason. The other meetings are really diplomats and negotiators and ministers and so forth, rather than heads of government. Progress does continue to be made. There is a meeting in Rio de Janeiro, which is called Rio Plus 20, which will occur in 2012. It's 20 years on from the Rio Earth Summit, so we can anticipate some more progress being made there. So that process is still ongoing, but as I said, it's no longer focused on securing a treaty, although that may come eventually, a global treaty. It's focused on actions by individual countries at the moment, and fulfilling a number of other pledges. The other bit of the question you asked was about, sorry.
The report which your commission produced. How do you feel that's been taken up by other countries, such as America, for instance? Has it influenced other countries to change?
Will was the author on that report, and I'm sure he's got some good things to say, but could I just say briefly that we are having an influence just by going out and meeting other people. I met President Obama's climate advisor earlier this year, who was very impressed with the work the Climate Commission was doing and was seeking ways of sort of replicating some of those objectives in the USA. So perhaps this is a good model for some countries to get by. But Will's report, as something separate, has had influence, I think, well beyond what we had anticipated.
I'll just add one quick comment, and obviously I'm biased, so you've got to take what I say with a grain of salt. But just a couple of weeks ago, the advisor to Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, was down at the meeting that Leslie and I were at in Melbourne, looking at a 4-degree world. And he used the critical decade for the title of his talk. He'd obviously read the report and thought it had a good point to make and actually presented the framework well. But I want to get on to the broader question you asked, which I thought was a fascinating question, is what influence does this commission actually have? That's a question that we ask ourselves very often, because we come to these regional centres, we have wonderful conversations, meet business leaders, meet community leaders, go out and visit industries and so on, but we don't know if there's any ripple effect. So my answer would be, you guys can really help us have an influence. Because when you go out and have a barbecue or go out on a social occasion, and climate change does come up, the carbon tax obviously comes up a lot. I hope that you'll be able to report some of the conversations we've had, some of the communication that we've tried to make about the science, about what the risks are, and about how we can actually get on top of the problem in a sensible way that actually generates a better and more vibrant economy in the future. So my answer to the question is, you guys can really help us have some influence, and I would encourage you to do that.
There was a lady in the glasses on in the middle.
My name is Denise Russell, and I'm at the University of Wollongong. I just wanted to ask about the estimation of sea level rise and how confident you were about that prediction, because I understand that it is rather a contentious point and that some scientists are estimating quite a different sea level rise. So is the Commission open to constant revision on that point, or are you just going to stick with the estimate? I think you were saying 50 centimetres to 1 metre or something like that. What do you think of these scientists who are putting the likelihood much higher?
The numbers that I was quoting are the basic predictions from the IPCC in 2007 and our averages. I also said that sea level is highly variable on a regional basis. So, for example, in Australia at the moment we've been seeing much higher rates of sea level rise in northern Australia than we have in other parts of Australia, because of course it also depends on the surface of the Earth that's going up and down at different rates due to plate tectonics. It also depends on, apparently, and I'm not an expert at this, on the proximity to other continents. So, for example, on the east coast of New South Wales, and one of my colleagues was just explaining this to me this afternoon, because we're rather close to the Antarctic continent, the gravitational pull of Antarctica apparently results in a slower rate of sea level rise along the east coast of Australia, and that is well understood and well modelled. So there are differences of opinion based on different models about sea level rise. Some of the sea level rise predictions from the IPCC report in 2007, for example, do not take into account melting of areas like the West Antarctic ice sheet, simply because they're not understood and modelled very well. So some people regard the sea level rise put forward by the IPCC as a potential underestimate. Other people think that it's somewhat overestimated. But I think we are all confident, due to physical processes, sea level is rising for two reasons. One is the extra input of water from the glaciers and the ice caps. We know that's happening. We also know from basic physics that as water gets warmer, it expands, and that accounts for some of the sea level rise as well. So we understand the physics of the sea level rise and why it's happening, but we also recognise that it's happening at different rates in different parts of the world.
Could I just add there, some of you may have read an article in The Australian suggesting that sea level rise had been grossly overestimated by the CSIRO. I think in our opinion that was a highly misleading article. It took one piece of published scientific data without reference to the rest of the vast body of literature on this, and then amplified it by using the views of a non-expert in the field. Oh well.
Can I ask you, Tim, can I ask you to say something about media coverage of this issue, which is incredibly important?
Well, the thing, you'll find that the media is full of opinions, yeah? All different sorts of opinions, all equally worthless unless they refer to the peer-reviewed literature.
I think it's, and I've said in the past that I think in many ways this debate has been captured by the two ends of the spectrum in terms of opinion, and as though it's a sort of a bipolar situation. It's either right or it's wrong. Now the majority of opinion actually sits in the middle, including dare I say it, the government and the opposition. They are both pledging to unilaterally reduce emissions by 5%. By 2020. Now, you wouldn't pick that up from the rhetoric, and you certainly wouldn't pick that up from the press, that there's a lot more things that people agree on than disagree on, but disagreement makes news, and disagreement makes good politics.
Why do you think, as a matter of interest, the government and the opposition are so reluctant to sell the policies that they have? I mean, watching the government selling the carbon price, there's no grand talk of the disasters that might await the world if we don't do it. It's a very, very narrow economic sales message, it seems to me. No comment?
Well, no, without commenting on policy or what the government or the opposition is doing, by definition, and I think this is a sort of it's a systemic issue, and business share it as well. We look very short term in what we're doing, and that's responding to the fact that I think we as a population look very short term at what we're doing. So they're responding to the way that we look at things, and business certainly values things that happen tomorrow a lot more than the things that happen in 20 years' time. That's standard economics.
On the far side, sir.
Good evening, everyone. My name's John, from the local area. I think that's what everyone's saying. My question for the Commission is, we've already spoken about the carbon dioxide tax to give the price signal to change behaviour from presumably coal to renewables. Tell me, given the unreliability of renewable energy, quite simply, where are we going to get our baseload electricity power from?
Well, do you want to...
this is why we say, and business has been adamant that we need to be very careful as we move through this transformation, that we protect our security of energy supply, which is, essentially, part of that is the electricity sector. So, I don't think anyone's saying that we should just close down coal-fired power stations. Well, it'll change people's investment decisions. So I don't think, for example, that there'll be any serious investment in the future in coal-fired power generation in Australia, for example, particularly brown coal. The things that'll step in the interim will be gas-fired power stations, gas-fired generation, and then over time, as the technology pulls through, we'll end up with far more sustainable renewables that are capable of actually producing baseload power.
So what you're saying is, in your opinion, renewable energy will be able to provide all the baseload power for this great...
No, I'm not saying that, because just think about the point I made before about this is going to be a multifaceted approach to solving it, and one of the technologies that's out there is carbon sequestration linked to power stations. So that's a possibility for the future. What I'm saying is that as we move further into the future and we pick up the low-hanging fruit, then we'll be able to move into new technologies which actually may have a serious impact on the way that we see things. So we could get a combination of CCS. We could end up with some serious solar baseload power generation through technologies that are undeveloped today, and things like that.
Do you? Can I just interrupt you? Are you allowed to have a view on nuclear at the Commission? Do you have a view on nuclear power? Are you allowed to have a nuclear? Yes.
I mean, nuclear power is one of those things that's often discussed, and we all have our own views on it. I don't think we have a unified Commission view on it, but if I could just point around the world, there are some places where nuclear power has been phased out. We're seeing that in Germany today, and Germany will be tackling this issue you raised absolutely head on. They want energy security. They don't want to go back into high emissions technologies such as coal-fired power plants, and they're phasing out their nuclear. So if anyone is going to solve this problem of how to create base load out of renewable energy, it's going to be Germans in the next few decades. So it'll be interesting to see how that challenge works out. Oh, there are examples, and I mean they're all small scale, but there is a liquid sodium solar system which you can use as a battery to store. We also have hydropower which can be used as a battery. So what we do is when there's plenty of wind around, we pump water up the hill and then we release it to generate hydroelectricity when we need the electricity later on. So there's a number of things that can be done. But to just return to the nuclear issue, just as there's some places phasing it out, there's some places which are heavily investing in it. And we can see in places like China, nuclear has a big future. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
Yeah, and if we talk about the broad-based approach to solving this globally, then nuclear will be part of the solution, whether it happens in Australia or not. The other thing that that's very clearly in a lot of people's minds, quite legitimately, is baseload power. A lot more baseload power from gas, and that's why there's so much interest in LNG from Australia, and there'll be a lot more interest in using gas for power generation in Australia as we go forward. And that's not a zero carbon solution, but it's lower carbon than, for example, brown coal.
Questioner there in the middle.
My name's Anne Brown and I live here. I feel it's been rather an academic debate so far, very kind of Australia focused. There was a book written recently called Consumptionomics, which was written by a bloke in Hong Kong, pointing out that if all the Chinese had the standard of living that we have, the Earth would not exist anymore, or at least an Earth that we could live on. Would the panel care to comment on the problems of a large population, both in Australia and in the world, and related standards of living? Thank you.
Look, the situation for the world population is it's going to grow from about 7 billion today through to about 9 billion by 2050. So that's a significant increase, but not unmanageable, because after that, the demographics suggest that the population is going to peak then and afterwards slowly decline. So could the world provide enough food to feed 9 billion people. I'm cautiously optimistic about that. I think there's signs that we could do that. Could everyone live at the standard of living that we Australians enjoy today, given the technology we use? Absolutely not. That's not going to be possible. Can we deny the people of China the right to have the same standard of living as we have? I don't think we can do that morally either. So what we need to do is focus on this technological issue to make sure that the technologies we use have ever less impact on the environment, so that we can, in case of climate change, have this transition to a low polluting energy base, so that our agricultural systems are more sustainable in the longer term. So our water systems are very, very efficient in the way they utilise water. All of this is possible. All of it takes investment, and all of it takes some sort of regulation and some sort of buy-in on the part of the public. So I'm not at all pessimistic that we can achieve that, but I can see it's going to be a huge effort.
When you say that it's not possible technologically, are you talking mostly about pollution, climate change, or are you talking about water and food and all sorts of other things as well?
The profligacy of the way we use everything. I mean, if everyone used the same amount of resources we did, it just wouldn't be sustainable. I mean, climate change and greenhouse gas emissions are one important part of that, but just the materials we use, food, water and so forth.
Just look at what's...
Someone at the, sorry, in the middle.
Just have a look.
You're
at
next.
What's happened historically is that as wealth increases, energy increases, or whether it's one driving the other, but generally as wealth increases, your use of energy increases. Now, for us to have a sustainable future as a planet, I think we need to de-link those two. And so, when the Chinese, who legitimately aspire to have the same sort of prosperity enjoyed in other parts of the world, the secret is going to be delinking that so that they don't need the same amount of energy that we have to achieve the prosperity that we've achieved today.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Carolyn. I live in the Wollongong area, which is about half an hour away from here. It seems to me that right-wing politicians, media, and certain large companies such as, mining companies are against climate action. I personally feel powerless when against these really, really powerful, powerful groups and what seems to me almost a propaganda against climate action. So my question is a very simple one, but I feel I need some advice. Do you have any suggestions about how we, really, as ordinary, hard-working, tax-paying people, can make a difference, have a say? That's my question. Thank you.
Well, look, could I begin by saying that not all mining companies or people who work in them are evil? We have one right here who's being part
meaning that some are.
There's a huge diversity of opinion even within corporations, so we shouldn't really tar them all with the same brush. But I agree with you that there is a big pushback globally, particularly from those who feel threatened by this. And I hate to say it because I'm approaching this group, but there's a group of men who are over 60 who also don't like change, who are pushing back, who are, still very influential in our society. And if I could just say to you, don't feel powerless. Margaret Mead said it all years ago, don't ever doubt that a few good people can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has, And I think it's just important that when you see something you believe is untrue, to engage. Don't let it pass,
But you were also asking what you could do in a practical sense, weren't you, as well as getting out on the street and demonstrating?
Any recommendations about what we can do? Because I'm unsure.
Can I add to that? I mean,
how I can make a difference.
One of the things that surprises me is it hasn't been more of when we had a drought in New South Wales, we had great education campaigns to save water. Why do we not have the same campaigns to save energy, carbon use?
You're absolutely right. Can I just say, when you ask what can you do, I think everyone's capacity is different. Whether you're a student in a share house or someone who owns their own place and has some disposable income, the options you have are very, very different. But there's one thing that unifies the whole lot, which is just showing some leadership in this issue. And this debate I remember with the cattle things in Indonesia, the inhumane practices in Indonesian slaughterhouses for Australian cattle. The volume of email traffic and at least electronic traffic that Australian politicians received over that was so large that it catalysed people immediately to start acting. So, and it doesn't take much effort to send your local member an email or whatever. So if you see something, you know, like that, if you see things going the right way or the wrong way, be heard. In a democracy, I think it's almost a duty, you know. And as I said, if you read something that's not right in the newspaper, write them a letter, send them a line.
Leslie.
If I could just add to that, I think there's all sorts of different levels. There's no single thing to do. There's our individual personal level and what we consume and how we consume and what we eat and what we buy and all of that sort of thing. And then there's a level of how we communicate and act within our communities. And certainly, you know, what we've seen today, for example, in the Illawarra, is really concerted action at a really grassroots community level. And that's, you know, talking to your neighbours, talking to your friends, getting involved in local action groups and that sort of thing. And then at a higher level, it's who you vote for, who you vote for at your local government, your state government level. You know, is climate change policy the main thing that drives your vote at any level? So, you know, I think there's lots of things you can do by being creative and active and positive, and collectively we can work together to change.
We've got about another 5 minutes, so I'm going to take a question from here and then we'll probably have time for another couple after that.
Hi, my name's Paris Rains and I have a question for Leslie. I just like to say I really liked your graph that showed all the different generations. I'm 16 years old and I'd just like to know, what role do you think young people have in the climate change debate?
Thank you. You're the same age as my son, and, you know, as I said, I'm here because of him and my daughter. Look, I think young people, it's terrific to see you here, because I have to say we've often been struck at these fora by how many grey hairs there are in the audience. It is your future. It is up to you really to push for change, because you've got the most to gain and to lose if we get it wrong. So all of those things that I just said to the lady up there count in spades for you. So getting involved in your talking to your family, which might be here with you tonight, talking to your schoolmates, looking at what career you might have. There's enormous opportunities, I think, for a career in areas that can really make a difference, be that in engineering or ecology or communication or psychology or teaching or whatever. And once again, you know, you're not voting yet, but you will in a couple of years. Use climate change policy to determine your vote, because really, in my opinion, it's the most important issue we should be voting about.
Yes, I'll come to you last. Yes.
Hello, my name is James and I'm a scientist. My question is, if the carbon tax is actually passed through the upper house, in terms of an industry or a company like BlueScope Steel, do you think the tax could be set up so that a percentage of it is actually pumped back into it, if not 100%, such that BlueScope would then have actual money and funding to build new infrastructure that would have produced less carbon emissions of such?
Anything's possible from a policy point of view, but particularly in a highly charged political environment. But the reality of what's happening with BlueScope as a energy-intensive, trade-exposed business, mega business, is that that's effectively what's happening. Is that they are being excused so that they can maintain competitiveness from actually having to buy the permits, which is entirely appropriate. Until we're satisfied as a nation that the competitors of BlueScope actually are under the same sort of regime. But I think we need to be careful from a pure policy point of view of overcompensating businesses for the future, because that then creates its own set of problems. So the objective for BlueScope should be that once we get through this transition period, hopefully when everyone around the world is engaged and they're competing on an equal playing field, that they're as competitive then as they are now pre a transition through a carbon tax. But we shouldn't be actually picking winners as industries, because we've done that in the past with disastrous consequences. So we should be doing the things that we can do well as a country, and sticking to that.
One last question. This gentleman in the front's been patiently waiting.
I'm Ian Davies from Milton. My question concerns windstorms, cyclones, hurricanes. Now, can you comment, please? My understanding from the scientific literature is that the frequency of Category 4 and 5 cyclones has nearly doubled since the 1970s, and the average wind speed has increased by 50%, which means the average destructive power, because it's a cube of the velocity, has increased by nearly 3.5. Could you please comment?
I think it sounds to me like that data may be a short period in the North Atlantic, which has some very strong periodicity. Most of the observations, when you take into account the Pacific and Indian Oceans, are that the frequency hasn't changed much, or if anything, it's actually gotten slightly less. But the intensity may be getting slightly greater, but not to the level that you indicated. So I think that may be a short-term data set from one basin. I think it was a period in the Caribbean and Atlantic when it was like that. The longer-term projections, and this is, I think, important for Australia, particularly for the East Coast, is that the frequency of tropical cyclones will probably decrease, but they will extend further south, and we may get an increase in intensity, but there's a debate of how much that increase might be. So that's the state of knowledge. This is a good example, by the way, of where I think the science will get better as we learn more. And this is a good reason for having this ongoing link between science and policy.
Thank you, everybody, for asking those questions. Thank you, everybody, for listening patiently. Thank you, everyone, for being so civil and good-natured and respectful. I hope it's given you something as well as the Commissioners something. I've actually enjoyed it immensely. I don't know much about climate change. I know a lot more after hearing this. I've found it fascinating. Now, I'm going to get Tim just to wind up, and I think I'm prepared to say that if you're keen to carry on the conversation afterwards, you might find these climate commissioners hanging around and you can have a cup of tea with them. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Sorry, thank you. Look, thank you so much, and could I thank you all once again for being here. It's been a great evening for us. I think we've learnt a very great deal. We would love to stick around for half an hour or so to talk to people. But I've heard there's a fantastic seafood restaurant somewhere in town, and I think the commissioners deserve a good dinner, so I'm going to sort of take them away by about 8 o'clock. But could I just ask you to thank our commissioners for making themselves available. And, thank you, and we wish you all the very best for the future. This is a critical time, and I think this community is well positioned to take advantage of it, so thank you. Good. Thank you very much, Paul, for that great introduction. And could I thank you all and welcome you all, thank you all for being here this evening and welcome you all to this event. This really is your evening, and I believe it's a great opportunity for people to engage with some of Australia's best minds on climate science and on the business response to the challenge that climate change represents to all of us. Before I introduce my fellow commissioners and hand over to them, I just want to say a few words about the Climate Commission. The Climate Commission arose out of a promise by the federal government last year. The Gillard government came to power and set up the commission in February. We're an independent commission, however, so we don't do the bidding of government. We don't take direction from government, even though we're funded from government. But we are independent, and that independence is very precious to us. We are tasked with doing three things, really. We want to get out among the Australian public, discuss the science of climate change, economic options for a country like Australia to pursue as we address climate change, and also look at what's happening internationally. So that's our remit. We do that in a number of ways. We produce reports, and in fact our first report, called The Critical Decade, was presented to Parliament in May this year and received bipartisan support. So both sides of politics recognised that report as being a sound underpinning for our scientific understanding of climate change, and we were very pleased at that because we think that that bipartisan support is very precious, not just for the work we do, but for Australia addressing these very complex and difficult issues. We also engage in town hall meetings like this, but before we come to meet you, we like to know something about your community. So we arrived in Wollongong last night, had a very nice meal at one of your Vietnamese restaurants here in town, and then spent today going out and looking at the steelworks in town, visiting the university to see what's being done there, and also engaging with a number of your community leaders at the Green Jobs Conference at the Novotel. So we've got a bit of a sense, at least, of what some of the issues are for you and some of the initiatives that are happening in your community in relation to climate change. One thing the Commission doesn't do is comment on policy. We won't comment on government policy or on opposition policy for that matter, for the simple reason that we believe that if we give up a bit of power, so the power to do that, we gain some authority. The waters of this climate change issue are deeply muddied by many people with many different opinions. We want to stay away from that and present to you the basic peer-reviewed science, so that's the accepted science, and the broadest consensus views we can get in the economic and political areas, as I said, of what's happening overseas. I just want to say a brief word about peer-reviewed science because it's often misunderstood. When an article gets sent in, submitted to a journal and reviewed, the process is a little bit like an auditor going through a set of books or accounts at a business. They'll go through and make sure that all of the figures add up, make sure that it's internally coherent, so in the case of science, so that it conforms with our understanding of physics and chemistry and so forth. And so once you get a bit of peer-reviewed science, you can be pretty sure that it's accurate. To rely on other sorts of science or someone's opinion is a bit like making an investment in a company without checking the books to make sure that they've been properly audited. We can all do the due diligence on that and make sure that we only use credible sources of information. They're readily available to all of us through the major scientific academies of the world. Look up the Australian Academy of Sciences statement on climate change if you wish. If you don't trust them, go to the US Academy of Sciences or the Royal Society in Britain, or if you don't trust any of them, go to the Chinese Academy of Sciences website and see what's being said. But without doing that due diligence, you are almost certain to be misled because there are many opinions out there which are unsubstantiated. So that peer review process is particularly important to us. I think now I'd like to hand over to our commissioners who will be making a presentation, but I'd like you to get to know us a bit personally as well, and I'm going to, as I introduce them, ask them to say a little bit about what got them into this climate change space. And I'll begin with myself. I became interested in climate change, well, I've known about the issue for decades, but I realised
is the show me state. It's the ultimate skeptical state. You've really got to show somebody from Missouri what's going on. So that got me interested in science. I did engineering at the University of Missouri and then came down to Australia. And it was really in the 1980s when I was doing a fairly ordinary career in chemistry, inorganic chemistry, so things like carbon cycle and so on, that I saw an international program that started studying the Earth as a system. A very visionary program for that time, and that got me very enthused. Going back to my engineering background, which is very systems-oriented, you create systems like the system that generates steel out at Port Kembla. But it really got me thinking of our Earth as a system, the role of us humans in that, and of course the climate is a very important part of that system. So it's sort of a winding tour starting from that abattoir in Sioux City, Iowa, but eventually ending up studying the planet and really getting enthused about how science can really tackle some of the most important issues we face.
Thanks very much, Will. I'm glad you're not a slaughterman. You didn't go into the abattoir business. Could I introduce Professor Leslie Hughes, our next Climate Commissioner, who along with me is at Macquarie University. Leslie is a world expert on adaptation and climate change, and particularly impacts of climate change on biodiversity.
Thanks, Tim. I got into climate change research basically by default. I'd done my PhD on ant behaviour. I'm a behavioural ecologist and zoologist, And after following ants around the bush for about 4 years, I was pretty heartily sick of that and was looking for something else to do. And somebody said, you know, I think climate change might be an interesting issue. And that was 20 years ago, and indeed it was an interesting issue then, and it has become an even more interesting issue since. And I've stayed in climate change because I've become increasingly concerned about the risks to our ecosystems from climate change. But really the fundamental reason why I do things like this is not because I'm a scientist, it's because I'm a parent, and I do this because I'm concerned about my children's future.
Thanks so much, Leslie. Our final member of the Commission is Mr. Jerry Houston, who has recently retired as President of BP Australasia. And Jerry, you seem to be the odd one out. Why are you here?
Well, a very good question, Tim. I suppose in my mind it goes back to
Welcome everybody. Welcome to this town hall conversation with 4 of Australia's climate commissioners, 4 of the 6. I'll introduce them and myself in just a moment, but first of all I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders from many other communities that may be here tonight. My name is Paul Barry. I'm a former ABC journalist. Hope you won't hold that against me. I'm also an author, and I'm going to be the traffic cop here tonight. My job is merely to make things run smoothly, to ensure that we have a civil conversation. The climate commissioners are here to explain their view of climate change and what we need to do about it to you, but they're also here to listen. And so after they've given their presentations, we will get some question time. We will have something like an hour, and I'll talk to you a little bit later about how I want to run that. But you will get a chance to ask questions, and they'll get a chance to listen to you and to your concerns. The climate commissioners we have here tonight are Professor Tim Flannery, who is the Chief Climate Commissioner here on my left. Right, as you look. Mr. Jerry Houston, who's on the far end. Professor Leslie Hughes, and Professor Will Steffen. Tim Flannery will introduce them properly in just a moment. The aim of this evening is to begin a conversation, and first of all, what the commissioners are going to do is going to tell you what they've done in Wollongong today, and also explain some of the basics that, about climate science and what they believe should be done about it, about the global warming. The first person we're going to hear from is Professor Tim Flannery, who is the Chief Climate Commissioner. He's just got off a plane. He's feeling pretty tired, but he's going to lift himself for you. He's one of Australia's leading writers on climate change. He's also a very popular writer on climate change. He's a fantastic writer on climate change. He's an internationally acclaimed scientist. He is also an explorer and conservationist, and he was Australian of the Year in 2007. He's held various academic positions. He's been Professor at the University of Adelaide, Director of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, and Principal Research Scientist of the Australian Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Tim Flannery.
Probably the late 90s that I'd really missed something. For a decade and a half before that, I'd been working in the mountains of Melanesia, climbing remote mountain summits in the Solomon Islands, on Papua New Guinea, West Papua, and so forth. And one thing I noticed wherever I went was that the tree line was advancing. And initially I thought maybe the tree line was advancing on the mountains because people were using the mountain summits differently, that perhaps they were burning in a different way or had stopped burning, and so the trees were able to advance. But it was so consistent that eventually I realised that there was something more behind this. It was only when I read the scientific literature with a bit more diligence than I had in the past that I realised this was a very clear signature of the warming trend that we see globally, and that somehow, even though I was a trained scientist, I'd missed the full significance of it. So once I had that realisation and had read the science, I was committed to learning more about climate change and becoming more engaged with the issue, because I thought if I've missed a trick here, if I've missed understanding it, then I don't know what hope my mum and dad or other people who aren't scientists have of getting up to date with what's happening. So that's how I got here, that's why I'm here before you this evening. Will Steffen, Professor Will Steffen, is he'll be giving the first presentation, so I'll introduce him next. I don't know whether you want to speak from there, Will, or come up here, but you're most welcome to do whichever.
So Do you want me to then go into the presentation straight away?
No.
I'll speak from here.
Sure. I was just going to say to Will that Will is one of Australia's most respected, or the world's most respected climate scientists, and he's got an interesting personal story to tell.
Yeah, well, look, I got interested probably a long, long time ago is where it started from. My native country, I was born and raised in the US, as you can probably tell quickly from my accent, but in a very small town in a rural state called Iowa, we only had one field trip, I remember, because we talked to some people out at the Blue Scope Steelworks today, and they had students coming in all the time. Well, I only had one, and that was to an abattoir in Sioux City, Iowa. And I decided there's got to be better things to do in one's life than to study abattoirs. So I guess that got me off on a different direction. But really, my roots in America come from a state called Missouri, and if anyone knows American states, they all have nicknames. And the nickname for the state of Missouri